Considering the French invented motorsport, it's quite impressive for all the wrong reasons that France has only had one Formula 1 world champion, that being Alain Prost, who won 4 titles between 1980 and 1983, excluding 1992 because he was on a sabbatical. Which seems crazy, because in other forms of motorsport the French have been pretty good. If your name was Sebastian in the early part of the 2000s and you were involved in rallying, there was a very good chance that you were going to win multiple WRC titles. Autosport ran an article called Sebastian Loeb Ruined Rallying, and they were right, but nobody will ever doubt his skills, and I would go as far as to say that he is the greatest driver of the last 30 years. Fight me. Then there was Sébastien Ogier, who did a similar amount of rally ruining just as we thought it was going to pick back up again. I wouldn't watch rally at the time, mostly just check in with it, but seeing Loeb and Ogier destroy everybody wasn't exactly making me want to start watching it again. Then, in endurance racing, the French have been pretty successful there too, particularly at Le Mans. I mean, yes, the most successful man at Le Mans is a Danish fella with a Belgian and a Brit behind him in the most win stakes, but France has 42 victories at Le Mans with 28 drivers, including the likes of Yannick Dalmas and Henri Pescarolo. This puts France second on the all-time table in terms of victories by country, behind the UK, which has 45 wins from 34 drivers. But back to Formula 1. The French have had a fair few drivers who have had decent careers, but only one has won the championship. French drivers that have won Grand Prix aside from Prost are René Arnoux, who has got 7 wins, Jacques Laffite, who has 6, Didier Pironi has 3, Maurice Trintignant, who was a start of the early days of the F1 World Championship, has 2 wins, and then the last of the multiple winners are Patrick Depailler, Jean-Pierre Jabouille and Patrick Tambay. Then you've got Jean-Pierre Beltoise, François Sever, Jean Alesi, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly, who have just 1 win. In total, France has 81 Grand Prix victories, and it's scary to think that Lewis Hamilton and Michael Schumacher have that tally by themselves and will still get change. But one driver I skipped on that list, simply because I want to talk about his career today, is Olivier Panis. With Prost approaching the end of his career in 1993, France's hopes for their next world champion were going to lie with Jean Alesi, the French Sicilian showing incredible pace as he fought with Ayrton Senna of all people in a semi-uncompetitive Tyrrell at the 1990 US Grand Prix. And at around the same time, France had some other drivers on the grid, like Yannick Dalmas, who has won Le Mans several times, Olivier Guyard, Eric Comas, Paul Belmondo and Bertrand Gachot. To an extent. He raced on a Belgian licence, but he has dual nationality. Panis' junior career was much like a lot of the drivers who came through at the time. Karting, local junior Formula 3 series, Formula 3000 and then into Formula 1. Most of the drivers that I've looked at in these kinds of retrospective videos will have raced in the UK at some point because at the time, British Formula 3 was the place to be racing in the late 80s and early 90s, with so many graduates to F1 at that particular time. And if you've watched a few of these videos, you'll have seen so many names you'll recognise. Now, not all of them went into F1, admittedly, but you've got the likes of Barrichello, Magnussen, Hill, Herbert, Alesi, Hakkinen, Coulthard, Kenny Brack, Gilles de Ferran, Dario Franchitti and others, all passing through the UK at some point. These days, with the FIA streamlining the series, drivers are more likely to be involved in the European Formula 3 series, while British F3 is now called GB3. Panis won the Formula Renault 2.0 series, a car you might have driven on iRacing at some point in a more modern spec, and then graduated to French Formula 3 in 1990 where he finished 4th. He did French Formula 3 again in 1991 where he was 2nd, and then won it in 1992. French Formula 3 merged with German Formula 3 in 2002 to become the European Formula 3 series, and that's where the likes of Kubica, Hamilton, Rosberg, Vettel and so on came through in the early part of the 2000s. After Formula 3 came Formula 3000, which is now Formula 2. Panis had competed in Formula 3000 in 1992 while also in F3 and finished 10th, but in 1993 he was in full-time and had an alright first round at Donington, but then it petered off a bit, finishing 6th at Silverstone and then retiring from the races at Pau and Pagusa, after which he bounced back and won the next 3 races at Hockenheim, the Nürburgring and Spa, before finishing 10th at Manicourt and retiring from the season finale at Nogaro. And Formula 3 was also in a bit of a transition phase at that time. It was the first season where everybody was using the same chassis, even if the rules allowed multiple chassis for the teams to pick from. The manufacturers had agreed to have a 2-year cycle for their cars, which should have reduced the costs, because what would happen was at that time, the teams would turn up with their cars, but then the following year, everybody would switch to whatever the fastest car was the previous year, if you follow me. On the grid that year were several drivers whose names you might recognise, Panis being one of them, but you'd also got Pedro Lamy, who was in second place, with David Coulthard, who finished in third place. There was also Gilles de Ferran, Max Papis, Jan Lammers, Pedro Diniz, Hideki Noda, Ivan Muller, who would have some success in the British touring cars, Olivier Beretta, Emmanuel Callard, and Frank Legorc, or Legorce, I forget how to pronounce that one. But most of the names mentioned there would be in Formula 1 at some point the very next year. And through winning the F3000 series in 1993, Panis was snapped up by Ligier for 1994, so they had a French driver driving for what was effectively the French national team, and he'd make his debut at the first round of 1994 in Brazil. Ligier's 1994 car was a B-spec version of the previous year's car, the JS39. Ligier had employed computer-assisted driver aids for the 1993 season, and it might have been a case of just updating the car to not have them, but I can't find any confirmation on that. In 1993, the car had been pretty decent, finishing 5th in the Constructors and finishing only a handful of points behind Ferrari, but that wasn't translating well into 1994. Despite this, Olivier was finishing on the fringes of the top 10 or just inside it. He finished every single one of the first 6 races of the season, with his debut race being 11th, then 9th at Okayama, 11th at Imola, 9th at Monaco, 7th in Spain, 12th in Canada, and then retired from the French Grand Prix at Manicourt. 12th then came again at Silverstone before surprising everybody with a 2nd place at the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, and this being with the track in those days suiting powerful engines like the Ferrari V12 or the Renault V10. Panis had actually qualified 12th for that race and managed to escape the massive pile-up caused by Hakkinen at the first corner. As the rest of the field dropped out, he found himself in second, finishing 54 seconds behind Berger, while Eric Bernard in the other Ligier was third. The points were given to a Ferrari, the 2 Ligiers, the 2 Footworks, and a Larousse. That's how much attrition there was. He was then 6th at Hungary, which got him another point, and he scored his final points of the season at Adelaide, which was actually the final round of the 1994 season. He finished every single race except for the French Grand Prix, and he was also disqualified from the Portuguese Grand Prix because he had excessive wear on the plank underneath his car, like Schumacher had done at Belgium. For 1995, Ligier had been bought into by Flavio Briatore, and the powerful Renault engines had been given to Benetton, with Briatore managing to convince Mugen to supply Ligier instead of Minardi. At the same time, the Ligier was essentially a Benetton clone, which might have attributed to some of the success the team had that year. While Panis was in one of the Ligier seats for the whole season, the other seat was split between Martin Brundle and Aguri Suzuki, which was done at Mugen's insistence. And the car was a regular point scorer, and under the current system it would have scored quite decently, as every single race Panis was in the top 10, except for the races he retired from, obviously. Brundle as well was in the top 10 for every race he finished, and in that Ligier, Panis was able to score 2 4th places at Canada and Silverstone, but then took a surprise 2nd in the Australian Grand Prix, which was another race that nobody wanted to finish, much like the previous year's German Grand Prix. At first glance, it does look quite impressive that Panis managed to drag a Ligier up into 2nd place for the Australian Grand Prix of 1995. And then you look at who won. It was Damon Hill in a, very competitive Williams, and he won that race by 2 laps. It allowed Panis to finish 8th in the standings in 1995, a very good return for a team that was often found in the mid-grid after their moderate successes in the 80s. 1996 was up next, and now Ligier was getting technical support from Benetton, with Tom Walkinshaw now being part of the operation. So where would this lead Panis next? Monaco Grand Prix victory, that's what. And guess what? It was another race that nobody wanted to finish. And while it might seem like a fluke, it came because Ligier went bold with their strategy for that particular race. The race started out wet, and Panis' car had been filled to the brim for the start of the Grand Prix. While other drivers were falling off left, right and centre, Panis had overtaken Brundle, Herbert and Hakkinen on track as he climbed up the order, and made his change to slick tyres at the exact right moment, so he made up even more time on everybody else. He overtook Irvine at the Lowe's hairpin and was up to an unlikely 3rd as a result. This became 2nd when Hill's Renault engine blew up in the tunnel, and then the lead when Alesi retired with handling issues. Due to the slower race pace thanks to the wet race start, the race was called on lap 75 of the scheduled 78 because the 2-hour time limit had expired, and only 3 cars, that being Panis, Coulthard and Herbert, saw the checkered flag, and Panis finished the race with barely enough fuel to get back to the pits. There wasn't enough fuel to turn the engine over once all the post-race checks were completed. That was pretty much the only highlight of the season because he only scored 3 times in 1996, Brazil, Monaco where he won, and again at Hungary. But in 1997, things were about to pick up again. He was going to a new team. Well, I say he was going to a new team, he was staying at the same team, but that team was being renamed. Alain Prost had bought the Ligier team and it was now renamed Prost Grand Prix. While still powered by Mugen, the cars were one of the first teams to run Bridgestone tyres, along with Stewart, Arrows, Minardi and Lola. Although Lola were gone after just one race in 1997. Well, I say that, they never even made the race because they didn't even qualify. But with these new tyres, Panis showed a lot of potential in a car that was expected to be mid-grid at best. And I've explained this multiple times, but I'll mention it once again because some people might be new here, but the Bridgestone soft tyre that year was equal to the Goodyear hard tyre. So while the Bridgestones took longer to come into the operating window in normal conditions, at very hot tracks or tracks that had incredibly high degradation, the Bridgestone tyres were superior to the Goodyear ones. Back then, the compound you ran in qualifying was the compound you raced on, and if the Goodyear teams took the harder compound, they might be able to last a bit longer at the expense of pace. But the Bridgestone teams had another compound harder still, and this played right into the hands of Prost at several races in the early part of 1997. At the Brazilian Grand Prix, Panis took third place, and was only 15 seconds off race winner Villeneuve and 10 seconds off second place Gerhard Berger. But in doing so, he'd beaten the likes of Hakkinen and Schumacher, who had superior cars, but had been destroying their tyres, with the Ferraris suffering big time out there, even if it had qualified second on the grid and led most of the opening lap. The next Bridgestone car was Trulli's Minardi in 9th, and Panis had qualified 5th on the grid, with the next Bridgestone runner in qualifying being Hill's Arrows, half a second behind. Panis had only been 3/4 of a second off pole position, which in 1997 was like Piastri taking Chinese Grand Prix pole by 0.082 a few weeks ago. To prove it wasn't a fluke, Panis went even better still at Argentina, starting the race 3rd on the grid, with the next Bridgestone runner being Barrichello, who was about, half a second behind him or something along those lines, and Panis had qualified ahead of Schumacher, but he didn't finish the race because the electrics went. At San Marino, he qualified 4th but was 8th and a lap down come the end, but he went and finished 4th at Monaco in the pouring rain, where Barrichello was 2nd on the same tyres, and then he took another podium at Barcelona. This time he was 2nd rather than 3rd, and he might have won the race but got held up by Irvine trying to lap him, and was closing in on Villeneuve at a rate of over a second a lap. Some people in the media at the time thought that Panis might be a dark horse for the title, as he was now up to 3rd in the standings, behind only JV and the Michael. But it was all about to come crashing to a halt in Canada. I'll need to do the race in more detail at another time, but in this race, Panis had qualified in 10th position, the second fastest Bridgestone runner because Barrichello was 3rd on the grid. And he then lost his front wing tagging another car at turn 2, and later on in the race, damaged the right rear suspension when he clipped the wall coming out of turn 4 I think it was. Going into turn 5 a few laps after that tag, the right rear suspension failed and the car turns in towards the inside wall. It glances off that wall but then bounces across to the other side of the track, smashing into the tyre wall and breaking both of Panis' legs. Panis would be out for most of the season. He returned at the Nürburgring where he scored a point, but that was going to be it for the rest of that season. 1998 would be the complete opposite of 1997. Not only was the Prost car a pièce de merde, he still had pins in his legs from the surgery following the crash in Montreal, and he just couldn't get to grips with the car. To be fair, neither could Trulli, and Trulli's single point of the season came at the Belgian Grand Prix that year, where half the field was wiped out on the first lap, and Panis is listed as a non-starter because Trulli got the spare car for the restart. Panis' season was so bad, he was below Ricardo Rosset come the end, a man who didn't qualify for 5 Grand Prix over the course of 1998. 1999 would be his final season in blue. He did show some return to that 1997 form, but it was very difficult to keep it consistent. In the first 5 races of 1999, he finished only once at Brazil, where he scored just 1 point. The only other time he would score would be at Germany, while Trulli only had 1 point score all season until he took his podium at the European Grand Prix. Panis probably could have scored more points, but if it wasn't the car letting him down, it was the pit wall, and he would leave the Prost team at the end of that season. After leaving Prost, there were talks of him going to Williams and joining up with Ralf Schumacher, and with the BMW engines coming in, it could have been a chance for Panis to show what he was truly capable of, and he'd finally have a front-running-ish car. But as it was, he turned down the contract with Frank Williams and decided to go to McLaren instead, as a test driver. It would seem odd for him to do this, because he was a Grand Prix winner, not a test driver, but it was actually very good advertising for him. McLaren had the current world champion in Mika Hakkinen in 2000, and Panis was regularly matching the times of Coulthard and Hakkinen in testing. Like mentioned in other videos, back then you could have a decent career as a test driver if you were knowledgeable about setup and good at feedback, even if your pace wasn't as good as some of the other drivers on the grid or the existing drivers in the team. The drivers that helped to develop Schumacher's Ferraris were Luca Badoer and Marc Genet, for instance, two guys who did nothing in the grand scheme of things in Formula 1. After a year testing at McLaren, Panis was offered a contract with BAR, who were having ambitions of moving up the grid. But the BAR that year had its problems. It was crap in qualifying, which nullified any decent race pace it had. While Villeneuve got that car to the podium twice in 2001, Panis made the points just, well, twice, with a 4th in Brazil and a 5th at the A1 ring, now the Red Bull ring. He could have scored points in Australia, but he was penalised for a yellow flag infraction, and that pushed Kimi Räikkönen into the points instead. Panis was 14th overall in the standings that year, and was 14th again in 2002, where his car would spend more time at the side of the track than actually on the track. So for 2003, he was going to go to Toyota. Like BAR, Toyota had aspirations of moving further up the grid, and they were going to rely on Panis' experience to help them do that. By this point though, Olivier was approaching 36 years old. He'd made his debut in 1994 at the age of 27, which is old now, but back then it was about average. But Panis was a 37-year-old who had broken his legs, which would take the performance levels down of anybody that wasn't one of the world beaters. Martin Brundle said in 1997 that Panis was lucky that it was a clean break in both of his legs, because if it had been the ankles or the feet, as was the case for Brundle, it would have knocked him back even further. Much like his 2002 season, the Toyota struggled in the early part of that season, with retirements at 5 of the opening 6 races. But an 8th place at Canada secured a point for him, as this was the year the points started paying down to 8th as opposed to 6th. Another 8th place came at France, with a 5th coming at Hockenheim, which was the best result of the year. But in the 16 races of that season, he failed to finish 9 of them, as he finished 15th overall. 2004 would be his final season as a driver, and while the TF104 proved to be more reliable, it wasn't exactly pacey. Of the first 4 races of the season, Panis finished in the top 10 just once, with 9th in Bahrain, and took his first points of the season at Monaco. Much like in 2003, his best result was 5th, taken at the US Grand Prix at Indianapolis, but he wouldn't score again until Belgium, which would be his last ever point in Formula 1. 14th in the standings, once again. He announced his retirement during that season, and after the Japanese Grand Prix of 2004, he was replaced by the test driver Ricardo Zonta for the final round in Brazil. After he retired from full-time driving, he did some test driving through 2005, and then quit Formula 1 completely for 2006, after which he went into sports cars and has won the 12 Hours of Sebring. I think in class rather than overall, but still he's done alright in sports cars. Panis was a driver that definitely had something, and that 1997 season wasn't exactly a fluke, because the engineers at McLaren loved his feedback and they took it all on board to improve the car. And the fact that he was on par with Coulthard and Hakkinen, who had been together since 1996, is proof enough that he wasn't just some guy who occasionally overachieved when everybody else's cars decided that they didn't want to finish a race. But the problem was, his cars were never the quality of the McLarens, even if the McLarens weren't above internally destroying themselves as a Prost would have done. But that was the case for many drivers then, and still is now. So you're left wondering, what if? What if that wishbone hadn't gone on strike at Canada? What if he'd never tagged that wall in the first place? What if he'd walked away from that shunt? Where would that Prost have come at the end of the season? And would we be talking about Panis in a different way all these years later? BAR and Toyota should have offered decent returns, but as we've seen in retrospectives on those two teams, they never achieved what they should have done, with Toyota being massive underachievers in F1. People talk about the underrated drivers of the last 30 or so years, and the usual suspects are going to be Heidfeld, Frentzen, Fisichella, Hulkenberg to an extent, or even the likes of Alex Wurz or the career test drivers like De La Rosa or Badoer or Genet who helped Schumacher out in those days. But when Mika Hakkinen is sad to see you go when you leave for another team, that shows enough that you've got something. With Alain Prost retiring at the end of 1993, France needed a new hope to get behind. They did have Jean Alesi, but he went to Ferrari in their banter years and ended up probably wasting the prime of his career. Panis, meanwhile, came in and started to show something, but when he did start to show that something, it was taken away because he broke his legs at Montreal in 1997. So, is there the possibility that we could put Panis up there with the other Nearly men of Formula 1? As always, answers on a postcard. So then, a look at the career of Olivier Panis that came to a crashing halt, no pun intended, in 1997, and didn't really pick back up after that due to not having the equipment underneath him, and maybe age and the injuries as well. But if this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help out with the picture purchasing piggy bank, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.